Welcome to the presentation of the PR2000, which is the compliance report for the Title I Part D program as part of the ESSA Consolidated Compliance Reports. The U.S. Department of Education, alongside the Office of Management and Budget, have worked on a packet for data collection covering years 22-23, 23-24, and 24-25. In this packet, we see the inclusion of different facility types, such as the one listed on the slide. In Part 1, LEA program facility types, state agencies will be required to fill out the neglected section for this part. LEAs will only need to respond to delinquent and at-risk sections of this part. In Part 1, the LEAs and state agencies will report the number of programs facilities and the average numbers that they serve and the average length of stay. Please note that the average number of days means the average numbers of days students receive program funded services from the facility. In Part 2, student participation, the LEA and the state agency will fill out the gender and race ethnicity sections with counts per program facility type. State agencies will need to fill out the neglected section. LEAs and the state agencies will need to fill out the delinquent section. LEAs will then need to fill out the at-risk section. In Part 2, Section B, both the state agencies and the LEAs will list the number of students by age. Similarly to before, state agencies will need to respond to the neglected section. LEAs and state agencies will need to fill out the delinquent section. LEAs will only need to fill out the at-risk section. In Part 2, Section C, the state agencies and the LEAs will need to report student numbers by student groups. The state agencies will need to respond to the neglected section. LEAs and state agencies will need to fill out the delinquent section. LEAs will then need to fill out the at-risk section. In the next parts of the PR2000, we have Part 3, Program and Exit Outcomes, which includes number of students enrolled in districts within 90 days after exit, number of students attain academic and career and technical outcomes while enrolled in the program, both in facility and 90 days after exit. Part 4, Academic Achievement and Proficiency, which includes academic achievement of long-term students for reading and math, students who show from initial to follow-up assessment whether there was an improvement up to one full grade level, more than one full grade level, negative grade level, or no change. Lastly, we see assessment proficiency, which is a completely optional data request. This is the number of students who attain proficiency or not in the state assessments. In Part 3, Program and Exit Outcomes, the state agencies will fill out the first column for Subpart 1 programs and report the number as appropriate. For state agencies, the second column will be grayed out. For LEAs, they will fill out the second column for Subpart 2 programs and report numbers as appropriate. For LEAs, the first column will be grayed out. In Part 4, following the same pattern as Part 3, the state agencies will report numbers on the first columns with Subpart 2 items grayed out. The LEAs will report numbers on the second column with Subpart 1 items grayed out. Part 5 is the program compliance self-check section. In this section, state agencies and LEAs will indicate compliance with program requirements. The first compliance self-check deals with program coordination integration for Subpart 2. The requirement of establishing a formal agreement with each local facility served under Title I Part D Subpart 2, and such agreement addresses the program provided by the LEA as well as the responsibilities of the facility. In order to comply with this requirement, the LEA must establish a formal agreement with each local facility served with Title I Part D funds. The strongest documentation for compliance with this requirement will include a copy of written agreement between the LEA and each facility. Such agreement would include a description of services provided by the LEA and a description of the facility responsibilities. By selecting the radio button for in compliance, the LEA is assuring that it has documentation of its compliance with this requirement readily available and upon request by TA and/or an auditor. If the LEA is not in compliance with this requirement or does not have such documentation, the LEA should select the rate button indicating not in compliance and use the space provided to describe how the LEA plans to come into compliance the following year. The second item in Part 5A is the Title I Part D Subpart 2 data is collected, disaggregated, and evaluated to show the program's impact on the ability of participants to maintain and improve educational achievement, accrue school credits that meet state requirements for grade promotion and secondary school graduation, make the transition to a regular program or other educational program operated by ALEA, complete secondary school or equivalent, and obtain employment after leaving the facility, and, as appropriate, participate in post-secondary education and job training programs. In order to comply with this requirement, the LEA should have documentation of the program evaluation. Strongest documentation showing compliance would be a copy of the evaluation of the Title I Part D program showing the impact it has had. If the LEA is not in compliance with this requirement or does not have such documentation, the LEA should select the rate button indicating not in compliance and use the space provided to describe how the LEA plans to come into compliance for the following year. Part 5B lists one of the requirements for state agencies receiving Title I Part D Subpart 1 funds. This requirement asks if the state agency used Title I Part D Subpart 1 funds as supplemental to the regular educational program. State agencies will demonstrate compliance with this requirement through documentation showing the number of hours added to the educational program through Title I Part D Subpart 1. By selecting the rated button for compliance, the state agency is assuring that it has documentation of its compliance with this requirement readily available upon request by TEA and/or an auditor. If the state agency is not in compliance with this requirement or does not have such documentation, the state agency should select the rated button indicating not in compliance and use the space provided to describe how the LEA plans to come into compliance for the following year. Part 5B2 lists the requirement that state agencies should prioritize services to children and youth who are likely to complete incarceration within a 2-year period. In order to comply with this requirement, the state agency should have documentation related to selection of program participants, including an explanation of how priority was given to children and youth who were likely to complete incarceration within a 2-year period. If the state agency is not in compliance with this requirement or does not have such documentation, The state agency should select the Ready button indicating not in compliance and use the space provided to describe how the state agency plans to come into compliance for the following year. Not applicable is only available for the reasons stated. Part 5B3 deals with the time and effort records for staff who were paid in whole or in part with Title I Part D Subpart 1 funds. Strongest documentation to show compliance with this requirement entails a list of staff paid with Title I Part D Subpart 1 funds, including percentage of time spent working in program, as well as documentation for charges to payroll, as required in the applicable Edgar cost principles. If the state agency is not in compliance with this requirement or does not have such documentation, the state agency should select the red button indicating not in compliance and use the space provided to describe how the state agency plans to come into compliance for the following year. Not applicable is only available for the reasons stated. Item 4 deals with the state agencies operating an institution-wide program and their requirements as stated in statute. In order to comply with this requirement, state agencies must have an institution-wide program plan for each campus operating such program. By selecting the red button for in compliance, the state agency is assuring that it has documentation for its compliance with this requirement, rarely available upon request by TEA and/or an auditor. If the state agency is not in compliance with this requirement or does not have such documentation, the state agency should select the red button indicating not in compliance and use the space provided to describe how the state agency plans to come into compliance for the following year. Not applicable is only available for the reasons stated. Part 5B, Item 5, deals with the reservation of funds for state agencies receiving Title I Part D Subpart 1 funds. The state agency shall reserve no less than 15% and no more than 30% of its Title I Part D Subpart 1 entitlement for transition services as described in statute. In order to comply with this requirement, state agencies should keep documentation of reservation of funds. Strongest documentation may include documentation supporting appropriate reservation of funds, as well as expenditure records related to transition services. If the state agency is not in compliance with this requirement or does not have such documentation, the state agency should select the Ready button indicating not in compliance and use the space provided to describe how the state agency plans to come into compliance for the following year. Part 5B, Item 6, lists the requirement for state agencies to evaluate its Title I Part D Subpart 1 program at least once every 3 years and to use such evaluation results to improve such program. In order to comply with this requirement, state agencies should keep documentation of evaluations of their program. Strongest documentation may include documentation showing program effectiveness and longitudinal studies of its Title I Part D Subpart 1 program, as well as documentation of the comprehensive needs assessment process and program planning. If the state agency is not in compliance with the requirement or does not have such documentation, the state agency should select the red button indicating not in compliance and use the space provided to describe how the state agency plans to come into compliance for the following year. Part 5C, Item 1, deals with the Title I Part D, Subpart 2 for LEAs. This requirement deals with allowable uses of funds for LEAs to support the operation of the programs that involve collaboration with locally operated correctional facilities. In order to comply with this requirement, LEAs should have documentation of their LEA and/or campus plans that provide a description of the Title I Part D Subpart 2 program, documentation showing a description and list of program beneficiaries, documentation of accounting records documenting program expenditures. By selecting the Ready button for In Compliance, the LEA is assuring that it has documentation of its compliance with this requirement readily available upon request by TEA and/or an auditor. If the LEA is not in compliance with the requirement or does not have such documentation, the LEA should select the red button indicating not in compliance and use the space provided to describe how the LEA plans to come into compliance for the following year. Part 5C, Item 2, deals with the time and effort records for staff paid in whole or in part with Title I Part D Subpart 2 funds. In order to comply with this requirement, LEA should have documentation of list of staff paid with Title I Part D Subpart 2 funds, including percentages of time spent working in program, as well as documentation for charges to payroll as required in the applicable Edgar cost principles. If the LEA is not in compliance with the requirement or does not have such documentation, the LEA should select the Ready button indicating not in compliance and use the space provided to describe how the LEA plans to come into compliance for the following year. Not applicable is only available for the stated reason. Part 5C, Item 3, deals with the requirement of LEAs to operate a program of support for students returning from a facility for the delinquent to a school operated by the LEA. In order to comply with this requirement, LEAs should have documentation of a description of its program of support as part of the LEA plan or in its written agreement with the facility. If the LEA is not in compliance with the requirement or does not have such documentation, the LEA should select the red button indicating not in compliance and use the space provided to describe how the LEA plans to come into compliance for the following year. Not applicable is only available for the reasons stated. If the LEA has any additional information relevant to the PR2000 that it wishes to include, it might be typed into the space provided in Part 6. Here we have some frequently asked questions provided by the U.S. Department of Ed. First, we can see that if the data cannot be disaggregated between delinquent and at-risk programs, the LEA is still required to report it. Then, we see if the LEA subgrantees Title I Part D Subpart 2 to multiple programs for facilities. Each one of those programs should be reported. Then, we see if the data cannot be disaggregated by all the specified categories of delinquent of facilities. In essence, you should report all programs. Then, we see that on this report, we do not ask for programs funded solely through Title I Part A. Continuing with frequently asked questions, we see what is the definition of for a residential treatment center. A residential treatment center is a facility that focuses on providing some type of individually planned treatment program for youth in conjunction with residential care. The Department of Education notes that it's unlikely that most treatment centers will meet the definition of an institution for delinquent children and youth. What is the difference between Subpart 1 and Subpart 2? Subpart 1 grants are made to state agencies, while Subpart 2 grants are made to LEAs. Due to the scope of service, state agency programs may look drastically different in contrast to local education agencies. For the purpose of PR2000, follow Subpart 2 guidance. What is the definition of at risk as it pertains to the PR2000? The term at risk, when used with respect to a child, youth, or student, means a school age individual who is at risk of academic failure, dependency adjudication, or delinquency adjudication, has a drug or alcohol problem, is pregnant or is a parent, has come into contact with the juvenile justice system or child welfare system in the past, is at least 1 year behind the expected grade level for the age of the individual, is an English learner, is a gang member, has dropped out of school in the past, or has high absenteeism rate at school. Part 3, Program Exit and Outcomes, 90 days after exit. How is the student tracked that returns to a district other than their home LEA? Is it the responsibility of the facility, the LEA, both, or the LEA only? The answer is it depends. Typically, when a youth goes to a different LEA that is not the home LEA, there will be a record request of some type. At that point, the request may come to the LEA or the facility, or in cases both. The fiscal agent receiving Title I Part D Support 2 funds is the one held responsible for providing the data for the PR2000. However, the LEA may have established other internal controls that may differ. Part 4, Academic Achievement and Proficiency, Assessment Proficiency Optional. What does that mean? Does the LEA decide if they can report this information? The answer is correct. The guidance states that this is an optional method of tracking progress. The LEA is not mandated to use it as part of the progress tracking system. Thank you for your time and attention. If you need assistance, please reach out to the contact information posted.